join me, if you will, in Genesis chapter 9. Genesis 9, we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 17 together this morning. If you're using the blue ESV Bible and the seatbacks out there, you can find our text on page 6. Genesis 9, the title of our sermon is Covenant. On May 17th, 1999, a gorilla was born at Gladys Porter Zoo in Brownsville, Texas. He was named after a song, apparently, by Rita Marley, Bob Marley's widow. The song was called Harambe. In 2016, Harambe was killed when a zoo worker deemed him a threat to a small boy who had fallen into his enclosure in the Cincinnati Zoo. If you were on the internet in those days, you know that was a kind of a wild time. There was a lot of very strong opinions held about this incident. Justice for Harambe was the cry of protest that rang out in the aftermath of this tragic incident that, as only a few people apparently understood at the time, could have actually been much worse. The indignation that arose over the decision to kill the animal and save the boy's life is, frankly, a bit baffling. Now, I don't think that we should go around shooting gorillas in the face for no reason, but there's no question that it was the right decision to kill the animal in order to protect the life of a human child. Even if the child or perhaps the parents, I don't recall, maybe they were being negligent at the time, either way. But this is just one example of the utter folly of our current society, even though that was 8 years ago. Right? Again, if you were on the internet even back in those days, if you're old enough to know, like 2016 was a crazy year. But it's only kind of gotten crazier. For instance, we just narrowly escaped in this last election having in our commander-in-chief a person who, at least during her bid for president in 2019, advocated for taxpayer dollars to be used for gender reassignment surgeries for prison inmates. As I said when I preached on this passage last year for Sanctity of Life, we are living in a world, and in particular a culture here in the West, that is living and dying in absolute rejection of God's order for the world. And as we've noted in the past couple of weeks in Genesis 8 and 9, humanity is starting afresh after the judgment of the flood through the salvation wrought by God in Noah's life. And as such, while Genesis 8 and 9 is not a mere rehashing of Genesis 1 and 2, there are many creational themes that are repeated in these chapters, although we do see them clearly transformed by the spread of sin in the world. And so we need to consider the passage before us in Genesis 9, and we need to consider what it says about the nature, the identity, and the obligations on mankind that God places. That He places on mankind as mankind, particularly in a fallen world. For God, here in Genesis 9, as the covenant Lord, once again, He places life-promoting commands upon this new humanity. Similarly, as He had done with Adam in Genesis 2, but now there's a formalizing and explicit naming of a covenant in Genesis 9, but also it happens in the midst of a sin-sick world. And so I want to read these first 17 verses of Genesis 9 and then give a brief outline, and then we'll get to work on them. Genesis 9 says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and then with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So there are really just two parts to this sermon this morning. First, in verses 1 to 7, we see the blessing and the obligations that God places upon this new humanity as they disembark from the ark into the world. And then second, in verses 8 through 17, we see the unconditional covenant obligations that God places upon himself with this new humanity. So let's look together at verses 1 to 7, where we see the blessings and obligations God places upon Noah and humanity. God's command to Noah can be summed up like this. In this now fallen and sin-sick world, mankind must promote and have regard for life, especially human life, in a way, of course, that is appropriate to living in a fallen and sin-sick world. Mankind must promote and have regard for life, especially human life, in a way that is appropriate to living in a fallen and sin-sick world. And we see this enforced from three angles in these 7 verses. First, we see mankind is to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth. We see that in verse 1 and verse 7. Second, mankind is to use the earth and the things in it for human flourishing, verses 2 to 4. And then third, mankind is to esteem human life as especially valuable, sacred, and worthy of protection, in verses 5 and 6. So verses 1 to 7 essentially say the same thing as one another. They form an inclusio that holds these verses together as one cohesive related thought. The clear and major obligation placed upon man in these verses, therefore, is to propagate his kind. We saw in Genesis 1 that the original design that God had for humanity is that we would grow up, get married, have babies who grow up, get married, and have babies, and so on and so forth, thus filling the earth with his glory. But this is still the case after the flood. God charges mankind to be fruitful and to fill the earth. This is also the third time that God is said to have blessed humanity. We saw it in 1:28 as well as in 5:2. In 1:28, God blesses mankind and commands the Edenic pair to be fruitful and to multiply. In chapter 5, verse 2, we're given a summation of what had happened back in Genesis 1, where we're reminded that God had blessed the male and the female there in Genesis 5 being told that when he created them, he named them man. And so the blessing of God in those cases, as well as this case here in Genesis 9:1, they're all linked in particular with man's fruitful multiplication on the earth. We see that in verses 2 to 4 where some differences begin to emerge from God's blessing of Noah here with God's blessing of Adam previously. So in verse 1 of chapter 9, things seem very much the same, but there are some differences that begin to emerge in these verses in 2 to 4. Previously, in Genesis 1, God blessed Adam and Eve. He told them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and to subdue it and take dominion over the animals in it. And while God charges this new humanity in Noah to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, even if painfully in light of the judgments handed down back in Genesis 3, not once does he charge the new humanity here in Genesis 9 to subdue the earth or take dominion over the animals. And so we need to consider here for a moment the way that Genesis 1, Genesis 3, and Genesis 9 relate to one another as we see a bit of a progression of the effects of sin in the world. Back in Genesis 1, mankind subduing the earth would have been painless and consistently productive. But in Genesis 3:17 to 19, that reality is overturned. Right? While mankind is still called to work the ground, he was sent out from the garden in 3:23 to work the ground. The curse in Genesis 3 tells us that mankind's relationship with the ground, which he had been meant to subdue, that relationship would now be one of toil, pain, and ultimately, in his own right, defeat. From the dust, the man was taken. Now to the dust we must all return. Similarly, we can imagine that his dominion over the animals in Genesis 1 would have been generally pleasant for all. There's not really any reason to suppose that it would have been anything but good for the animals themselves, as well as leading to humanity's delight and flourishing as Adam and his posterity ruled over the animal kingdom in God's place for God's glory. Our passage here, though, in Genesis 9, tells us of an overturning of that reality. While there's still a clear hierarchy that remains, man over animals, there's a significant change that's occurred. Man isn't told here to take dominion over the animals. Rather, what he's told is that there is now dread and fear involved in the relationship. Previously, Adam's hand would have been a tool for exclusively benevolent and peaceful ruling. Now, it has become, his hand has become that into which the animals are delivered that they may be food. There are clear and detrimental effects that have resulted from humanity's sin in these early chapters of Genesis. In Genesis 3 to 5, we find that after man's sin at the tree in the garden, he would now face an unruly ground that would not yield its increase willingly. Rather, it would conquer him in death. And then in Genesis 6 through 9, after the sin precipitating the flood, the animal kingdom, which previously would have served as willing participants in mankind's effort to build the city of God, they are set against him now. And so it raises a question about what's called the cultural mandate that was given at the original creation in 128. Now, I think it's quite incorrect to say that the cultural mandate has been obliterated. God does not actually repeal the mandate at any point here, but it is important to see that it has been exceedingly frustrated through mankind's rebellions against God. And so, while humans should and will continue to have children, be involved in public and civic life, engage in the practices of the arts and sciences, build homes and communities, towns and cities, we should seek to ameliorate the effects of the fall in this life, but we must have a realistic understanding about how sin in the world will perpetually impact our rule in the world as the human race. And so what this does, spoiler alert, we'll come back to this before we're done here, is that it prepares us for Jesus Christ in extremely important ways. But I do want to move on to verses 5 and 6. But before we do that, a quick note about verse 4. God does deliver the animals into humanity's hand for food, yet he still sets boundaries here. He says, "You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." You can imagine there are a few different takes the commentators give on this verse. I think it's quite likely a reference to the requirement that blood be drained from an animal prior to consuming its flesh. This essentially is a recognition that life is sacred, and blood is viewed in the Bible as the symbol of life. And so the idea is that the animal with its flesh now belongs to man, but the blood, the life, ultimately still belongs to God. And so this command here is in many ways preparatory for the law of Moses as well. There are numerous passages in the Old Testament that insist that the blood be drained before an animal may be eaten. We see it in Leviticus 3, in Leviticus 7 or 19, Deuteronomy 12, 1 Samuel 14. Also in Acts 15:29, the apostles at the Jerusalem Council, interestingly, decide among just a few things that they're going to counsel the Gentile converts to Christianity what they need to do. One of those things is not to eat meat with blood in it. Now that decision, if you remember when we preached through Acts last year, I'm sure you all do, of course. Remember exactly what we said about Acts 15 over a year ago. If you don't, I'll remind you. That decision, rather than necessarily confirming from this command in Genesis 9 or those in the Mosaic Law a universally binding command, since Jesus had, after all, declared all foods to be clean in Mark 7:19, it seemed to be an effort to help the Gentiles at the time to avoid offending their Jewish brothers and sisters and to distance themselves from the practices of the pagans from which they were coming and being saved. And so that's a comment on verse 4. We'll think a little bit more and some application about it at the end. But let's consider 5 and 6 now as we try to wrap up this first point of the sermon and its several subpoints. In verses 5 and 6, we see that God will require a reckoning for man's blood, both from animals and from men. So while the blood of an animal may be shed but not consumed, not even the blood of man may be shed without retribution. And this is because man is made in the image of God. We see that in verse 6. Now, Genesis describes humanity as being made in God's image and in his likeness at three critical turning points in the narrative of this book. Humanity is first created in God's image in chapter 1, 26 and 27. Then we are reminded in Genesis 5, after the fall, at a new stage of human history, in exile from Eden, that man was made in God's image, who bore children in man's image. And then here in chapter 9, we have a new humanity established after the flood. Each time man is said to be have been created in the image of God. And I think as we've said in those other texts, there are those who want to argue that the image of God in man is lost in the fall in Genesis 3. And frankly, given the frustration of man's responsibility to subdue the earth and to exercise dominion over its inhabitants, which those things are explicitly connected to the image in Genesis 1, while I don't think it's correct to say that man is no longer in God's image now, after the fall, we are on good ground to say that there is a distortion and a marring of the image that has taken place in the fall, in these falls. However, the double repetition of man as image of God in Genesis 5 and Genesis 9 is not to be discarded easily as evidence that man still meaningfully bears God's image, even if the commands to subdue and rule are not repeated, and therefore, even if that image is now marred. And so man as God's image, even in a marred sense, there is still a responsibility that mankind has to rule and to subdue. Though now that has become, in our own right, an essential impossibility in a fallen state. But this taking of human innocent life, here and by innocent, not sinless, but innocent in a more legal, criminal sense, it's an abomination before God, and he says it will result in retributive justice. And this calls us back to Genesis 4 and Cain's murder of Abel. Whereas there, in Genesis 4, the murderer's life was interestingly spared, here, the brother murderer will give a reckoning for his crime, and he must pay with his own life. And so this text tells us that God places a premium on human life. And so a just society would and should erect civil structures to defend, preserve, and promote the flourishing of human life. Now, while this is by no means this verse, these verses here in Genesis 9, they're not a thorough explanation in defense of government, it does give us a sense of the point and the purpose of what we should expect from our justice system, so often led by a civil magistrate. In other words, the magistrate's job is not to rob us blind and use some of that money to indoctrinate our children, take care of us when we are sick, cheer us up when we are sad, and keep us safe from every conceivable danger that we might face in the world. But there is a need. According to Genesis 9, there's a reality here for the need for a system whereby those who would harm their fellow man, particularly here by taking their lives, that they are punished for doing so. So we find in these verses, summing up a little bit this first point, these first 7 verses, God has recommissioned a new humanity to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth. This new humanity, however, while still obligated to subdue and rule, shall find those tasks, subduing and ruling, not just painful, but essentially impossible to do, at least in full. The ground and the animals will fight back against mankind, forcing them to look with continued hope to the painful yet possible responsibility to be fruitful and to multiply, as they, a la Genesis 3:15, await the seed of the woman who will come to crush the serpent's head and bring back subduing and ruling. So that's the first point, verses 1 to 7, God's blessing of humanity and the obligations that he places upon this new humanity. Let's look with the covenant that he confirms here explicitly in verses 8 through 17. God covenants with Noah and all the earth here, saying that he will never again flood the earth. And as we saw in several, especially chapter 7, but in this section, there's lots of repetition. If you took out all the repetition of verses 8 through 17, there would be like 3 sentences left maybe. The rest of it it's just over and over again saying, not a worldwide flood, not a worldwide flood, not a worldwide flood. Not going to destroy everything, all flesh on earth, making this covenant with you. And the parties named here are variously named as God and Noah, or Noah's family, every living creature of all flesh, or those that are on the earth, those that were with Noah. And so he makes this covenant, and he tells Noah and his sons that the covenant sign would be the rainbow. And again, as we pointed out before in a previous sermon on this text, it's really horrifying that the rainbow, a sign of God's gracious covenant faithfulness to all mankind, even in the midst of tremendous sin, it's horrifying that it has been turned into a symbol of high-handed rebellion against God and the goodness of His created order. Furthermore, it's just exceedingly ironic that the sign of this covenant with Noah, which was in light of God destroying life on earth for unimaginable sexual sin, it's ironic that that sign has been co-opted to promote unimaginable sexual sin. It's on people's cars, it's in their front yards, it's on their social media profiles. Rainbow flags are flown above schools and churches. The White House is lit up with the rainbow during the month of June, Gay Pride Month here in America. The rainbow is everywhere, and so is the perverted message to which it has been blasphemously attached. And the perpetually decaying moral fabric of our society, as indicated by this ubiquity of blasphemy, it's a clear sign that not all of God's enemies have been placed under the feet of Christ yet. But make no mistake, beloved, God is not mocked. What we sow, that we shall reap. And the truth is, at least in part, this degradation of this covenant sign, it is a judgment of God itself. It's not just a precursor to judgment, but it is judgment, according to a passage like Romans 1. But we shouldn't forget either, the rainbow, whatever our current culture wants to say about it, it is a sign of God's holiness as we think about how He judges sin. It's a sign of His grace as we think about His promise that He makes here. But what's interesting in this passage is who this sign is said to be for. Look in verses 14 and 15. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. So who is the sign for? Well, God is the one who will see it and remember. God is the one who does the remembering here. This covenantal language of remembering, as we noted last week in chapter 8, verse 1, when God remembered Noah, it teaches us, of course, not that God would forget, and as He's about to smite the earth with a flood, see the rainbow and pull back at the last moment, remembering that He had promised not to do that. Rather, the point is that the rainbow demonstrates, it is God's way of demonstrating His commitment to the propagation of life on earth. It is given, it's His way of fulfilling this promise. So the flood is a very important event where the chaos waters that God had tamed at creation, they are unleashed upon the world, as we saw, as an act of decreation. And yet, through the ark, He preserves a remnant from whom He will recreate a new humanity. And yet, as it was hinted at in 8:21, stated quite plainly in 9, 5, and 6, and will be incontestably shown in the rest of chapter 9 and beyond, the waters of the flood, which brought judgment and they served to cleanse the world of its corruption, they did not actually deal with man's sin. The summary of man in chapter 8:21 was that man's heart is still set on evil from his youth. And yet, God is gracious. And He promises that the sea, the judgment waters, their fierce and powerful nature of destruction shall never again be unleashed to end all flesh, in which is the breath of life. So as a sign, the flood was ultimately ineffective to actually deal with human sin, God promises that he wouldn't keep flooding the earth over and over again because it won't actually deal with sin. Rather, God will have to deal with sin in another way, which interestingly results in, according to Revelation 21:1, no sea at all. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And so perhaps this is why the fish get no mention, either in the judgment of Genesis 6 or the covenant of Genesis 9. I know I've talked with some of you about this, and you know I've been wondering about this question for a long time. Maybe this is not concerning to you at all. But if you notice here, God does not covenant with the fish. Back in Genesis 6 and 7, he doesn't mention judging the fish, though they are part of Genesis 9, the first couple of verses where they are given into Noah's hand for food. So I've been banging around in my head this question, what's up with the absence of fish? Well, perhaps the absence of fish from the judgment and from the covenant with Noah is meant to leave us with this lingering sense that while Noah comes through the flood as the head of a new creation, like I said, sin really hasn't been dealt with. You see, the sea and especially the great sea creatures in it, they in the Bible are powers that represent in Scripture hostile threats to humanity. This doesn't mean that fish are evil, but there is something to see here. In the Bible, the sea is an abyss that represents a hostile power that is set against humanity. And now, after the flood, man's dominion is marked by futility and dread. It's not fully regained. And so, the sea is not conquered. While it is held at bay by the Lord, it has not been conquered. There shall come one, though, from Noah's point of view, looking forward into the future, there is one coming to whose will the wind and the waves are subject. There is one coming who does and will walk on water, whose will supplies weary fishermen, weary professional fishermen, with a catch of fish that they had not imagined possible. One coming who will reign on the earth and punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, the fleeing, twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Isaiah 27, verse 1. And so, of course, this brings us to Jesus Christ. As we said, Jesus is a greater Noah. He is the last Adam. In Genesis 3-5, Adam gave way in a garden at a tree, and the result was toil and frustration with the ground, to which he must now return as he is conquered by death. In the gospel, Christ resisted in a garden and went to the tree and then into the ground, but then he burst forth from the ground victorious over death, over sin, and over the grave. In Genesis 6-9, Noah, the righteous, obedient, covenant man, stood as the head of a new humanity. And yet Noah was unable to bring about a full restoration of what humanity had lost in Genesis 3 through rebellion, which they had then doubled down on in Genesis 6 through further rebellion. Jesus obeyed where Adam failed. Jesus brings the rest Noah's father anticipated that Noah was unable to bring in full. Take this for what it's worth, but the word dominion or rule from Genesis 1:28 that doesn't occur here in this passage, it doesn't occur again in the Torah until Numbers 24. I actually think it's the only place in the rest of the Torah that it does occur at all. Numbers 24 is Balaam's prophecy about Israel when Balak wanted him to curse God's people. Do you remember what he said? He said, in the midst of the last prophecy, I think, he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall arise out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. And then in verse 19 he says, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of the cities. In other words, that prophecy about the Lord Jesus, he is the new Noah, he is the last Adam. He is bringing all his enemies into subjection under his feet. He's claiming the ground lost by Adam that Noah couldn't quite reclaim. Furthermore, we see a text like the one we read earlier in Isaiah 11, a solid Advent reflection. We see that the fear and the dread in the animal world in the branch of Jesse is pacified as the child and the viper and the lion and the lamb and the ox and the bear lie down and play together. In Christ, humanity reclaims genuine dominion of the world, though this is, to be sure, only experienced in full in the eschaton. And so the curse of Genesis 3 isn't touched at all by Noah, but it is dealt with by Christ. But even now, after Christ has come, the creation still groans in the pains of childbirth, waiting for the redemption of our bodies. And the strain between mankind and animals still prevails. And so, yes, Jesus is Lord, but just because of that and the fact that we're Christians doesn't mean that labor won't be painful or that you could go out and ride a shark without consequences. Work is still hard. Dominion remains aloof. Christ still has enemies, the last of which to be defeated is death. Death still has a grip on the world. But, and I can't state this strongly enough, that grip has been loosened. And he cannot keep his hold forever. In Adam, and even in a sense in Noah, humanity toils and labors, eking out an existence, trying to push back the effects of the fall, like we saw with Cain's godless descendants. They were able to produce significant cultural achievements, but then they still had to die. Now, we still have to die, but there's a difference. In Christ, while the effects of the fall are still present in our lives, they do not get the final say. We can work to produce, and we can strive and labor and toil, not aimlessly, not to be defeated, but as those who work for the Lord, as his kingdom advances to fill the earth, from which we shall arise in glory to rule over a subdued earth with him. So I want to close with a few points of application here, and then we'll be done. First, be fruitful and multiply. I probably don't have to tell you that, but now, look, I'm envisioning 3 different ways that you can do this. Bear children biologically. You can adopt or foster children legally, and you can make disciples, your own children or someone else. Right? The Old Testament places tremendous weight and significance to childbearing for good reason. In some ways, this weight and significance is perhaps changed a bit with the coming of Christ. The promised seed has come. And yet, Paul makes clear that childbearing is still important in the faithful women of God. 1 Timothy 2. And in Ephesians and in Colossians, he gives specific instructions to parents. And so, more importantly than how many children you have biologically or how many you adopt into your home, how many of them are you raising in the fear of the Lord? How many disciples of Christ have you made, mom and dad? Both of your own children, but of other people as well, whether young or old. And so the first point of application here, be fruitful, multiply, all in all, keep it up. Secondly, enjoy your steak and your vegetables if you're into that kind of thing. But we shouldn't abuse animals. Proverbs 12:10 says, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. And so while we don't want to be swayed by godless propaganda that condemns the eating of meat or values animal life over human life, we shouldn't mistreat animals either. But I want to come back to this question about eating meat with blood in it. As I said, Jesus declares under the new covenant that all foods are clean. Paul says in multiple places that food laws are essentially matters of conscience. And so I do believe that in the new covenant, that all foods are clean, that food laws no longer directly apply to Christians at all times, forever. And so we have freedom. But like with any freedom in Christ, we must not use our freedom to harm another. We should instead use self-restraint to build one another up in love. We should do all things to the glory of God. And so, do you have to be overly meticulous to make sure that your meat is bloodless? No. Eat. Be free. But use your freedom not for self-serving, but for others serving. Now, I'm not recommending that anyone go around drinking pints of animal blood, but be free. Thirdly, protect life. As we saw at the outset, our present society places no inherent value on human life. Especially our society disdains life at the beginning or the end of the spectrum. Animals and trees are valued more than people. Abortion is celebrated as the God-given primary right and responsibility of the human race. The permanent destruction of healthy body parts in children is hailed as gender-affirming care. The burdens of the sick and the elderly are euthanized out of our concerns and consciences. While cats and dogs are kept alive at extreme cost to their owners. And we've been lied into essentially every war that we've entered into for the past 100 years. You know, it really is astounding to me how cavalier our political leaders are with human life, how willing they are to ruin our children's lives, to send young men and women to kill or be killed in countries thousands of miles away from us. I said this before, but kids, very seriously, the broader secular culture of our day, politicians, Hollywood actors, social media influencers, most college professors at major universities, I'm painting broadly here, but they really do hate us, and they hate you. They wish you were never born, and for those of you who make it to see the light of day, they want to corrupt you and destroy you, and they want to render future generations less and less likely. And so we need to protect life in every way that we can. And lastly, live in hope. Live in hope, looking to the greater Noah, who has come and conquered and is now seated at the right hand of God. Noah provided temporary salvation for his family. They were kept safe from the waters. That even though they will never again be unleashed upon all of the earth, they represented, even after the flood, a dark and a powerful threat to human life. And in many ways, they still do. But in Jesus, in his coming, in his life, his death, his resurrection, and ascension to God's right hand, he provides for us a full and permanent salvation for those who are in his family. And we are kept safe, not only through the waters of baptism, but we are kept safe through the fiery judgment to come, in which the heaven and the earth give way to a new heaven, where all the hostile enemy powers represented by the sea are no more. And so, be fruitful, multiply, enjoy your food, protect life, and live in hope, looking to Jesus Christ. Amen.